Part 1. The distress signal came through at 040 hours, cutting through the silence of the bridge like a knife. Captain Jake Morrison was already out of his bunk before the second alarm sounded, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Talk to me," he barked, stepping onto the bridge of the Independence in his uniform hastily thrown on. Lieutenant Amy Chen's face was pale, her fingers flying across her console. "Sir, it's the colony on Haven Station. The signal just went dead, but before it cut out." She swallowed hard. They were screaming about an attack. The children's wing was hit first. Jake's blood ran cold. Haven Station was a civilian research outpost, home to 300 families. The children's wing housed the school and nursery for over 200 kids, ranging from infants to teenagers. "Who?" The word came out like gravel. "The Zeltari Council fleet, sir. They're still in orbit." For 3 seconds, nobody on the bridge breathed. Every human in the galaxy knew the unwritten rule, the one law that had kept an uneasy peace between humanity and the rest of the galaxy for 50 years. You could fight human soldiers, you could engage human warships, you could even attack military installations. But you never, ever touched human children. The Zeltari Council knew this better than anyone. They had written it into their own code after witnessing what happened to the Kresh Empire when they made that mistake 30 years ago. Humanity had burned 17 Kresh worlds to ash in retaliation, and the galaxy had watched in horror as human rage turned a spacefaring civilization into scattered refugees. "Battle stations," Jake said quietly. Too quietly. His crew knew that tone. "Get me Admiral Stevens on priority channel, then plot a course to Haven Station, maximum burn." "Sir, we're 3 hours out at best," the navigator said.
"Then get us there in 2."
Jake turned to his weapons officer, Lieutenant Patrick Kane. "I want every railgun charged, every missile tube loaded, and every Marine in full combat gear. This ends today." Amy looked up from her console, her expression grim. "Sir, incoming transmission from the Zeltari flagship. They're demanding we stand down and recognize their authority to enforce council law." "Council law?" Jake's laugh was bitter and cold. "Put them through." The view screen flickered to life, showing High Commander Zelnoth, his 4 eyes gleaming with what might have been satisfaction or contempt. His translator rendered his chittering voice into flat, emotionless English. "Captain Morrison, you will halt your approach. The colony has been harboring human resistance fighters who violated trade sanctions. We acted within our rights. You attacked children," Jake said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "You killed kids who were sleeping in their beds. Your species does not have special privileges." Jake smiled then, and everyone on the bridge took an involuntary step back. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just been given permission to hunt. "You're right," he said softly. "We don't have special privileges. But we do have one very special characteristic. We remember. And we make sure everyone else remembers too." He cut the transmission and turned to his crew. "Get me Earth Command. Tell them to activate Protocol Lionheart. Every human ship, every human station, every human colony. The galaxy is about to learn why that law existed in the first place." The Independence surged forward into the darkness, and behind it, across 100 star systems, humanity began to mobilize for war. Part 2. The Independence dropped out of faster-than-light travel, 2 hours and 17 minutes later, emerging into a scene of devastation that would be seared into Jake Morrison's memory forever. Haven Station tumbled slowly in its orbit. Massive holes torn through its residential sections, debris floated in clouds around it, some pieces recognizable as furniture, toys, and personal belongings. The children's wing was simply gone, replaced by a gaping wound that exposed twisted metal and shattered corridors to the vacuum of space. 5 Zeltari warships hung in formation nearby, their weapons still powered up, waiting. "Scan for survivors," Jake ordered, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "Reading life signs in the emergency shelters, sir," Amy reported. "Approximately 80 colonists. The rest she couldn't finish. Over 200 people dead. Most of them children who had been asleep when the attack came." Jake's hands tightened on the armrests of his command chair until his knuckles turned white. "The Zeltari are hailing us again," the communications officer said. "They're ordering us to withdraw or be fired upon." Battle Readiness Report. Lieutenant Kane looked up from his weapons console, his face hard as stone. "All systems green, sir. Marines are in drop pods and ready to deploy. We're outnumbered 5 to 1. But we've got surprise and rage on our side. That'll do." Jake opened a ship-wide channel. This is the captain. What we're about to do will be recorded in history books. The enemy has committed an act so heinous that it demands immediate response. We're going to show them why humanity doesn't make rules for the galaxy. We make examples. All hands, prepare for combat. He switched to external communications. High Commander Zelnoth, this is your only chance to surrender. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. You and your crews will stand trial for mass murder. The response was a spread of plasma fire from the nearest Ex-Zeltari cruiser. Brilliant green bolts that lanced across the void toward the Independence. Evasive maneuvers, Jake snapped. Return fire. Target their weapon systems first. I want prisoners who can answer for what they did. The Independence rolled hard to port, her enhanced engines pushing the crew deep into their seats as the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate. The Zeltari plasma bolts streaked past, missing by mere meters. In response, the Independence's railgun spoke with thunderous authority, sending magnetically accelerated slugs downrange at a fraction of light speed. The lead Zeltari cruiser's shields flared and buckled under the impact. Human weapons technology had advanced significantly in the decades since first contact, driven by a species that understood one fundamental truth. The universe was not a safe place, and peace was only possible when you could make war terrible enough to prevent it. Direct hit on their forward weapons array? Kane reported with grim satisfaction. They're venting atmosphere from multiple decks. Good. Next target. But the Zeltahari were already adapting, their ships spreading out to surround the Independence. Their strategy was sound. Use superior numbers to create crossfire situations that would overwhelm the human ship's defenses. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. These were not normal circumstances. Incoming message from Earth Command, Amy said suddenly. The fleet is mobilizing. 50 warships are en route, ETA 6 hours. Admiral Stevens says to hold position and survive. Help is coming. Jake almost laughed. 6 hours might as well be 6 days in a ship-to-ship engagement. But the news served another purpose. It told the Zeltari that this wasn't going to be a quiet incident that could be swept under diplomatic rugs. Humanity was coming in force. Broadcast that on all frequencies, Jake ordered. Let everyone in range know what's happening here. As Amy complied, the Independence shuddered under a direct hit to her starboard shields. Warning lights flashed across the bridge. Shields at 60%, Kane called out. We can't take many more hits like that. Then we don't get hit. Jake leaned forward. Pilot, take us into the debris field from the station. Use it for cover. Weapons, prepare the Harbinger missiles. There was a moment of shocked silence on the bridge. Harbinger missiles were planet crackers, weapons so destructive that their use was restricted to end-of-civilization scenarios. Each one carried enough antimatter to vaporize a small moon. Sir? Kane's voice was uncertain. I'm not using them on planets, Lieutenant. I'm using them on those ships. They wanted to see what happens when you break the one rule humanity cares about. Let's show them. The Independence dove into the expanding cloud of debris, using chunks of the destroyed station as cover while her crew worked frantically to load the forbidden weapons. Jake watched the tactical display, seeing the Zeltari ships hesitate, uncertain whether to follow into the debris field where their size would be a disadvantage. That hesitation cost them missiles armed and ready, sir, Kane reported. Fire on my mark. Target the flagship first. Jake waited, counting seconds, watching the enemy ships cluster together as they tried to coordinate their next move. Mark. 4 Harbinger missiles erupted from the Independence's tubes, their drives burning brilliant white as they accelerated toward the Zeltari formation. Point defense systems on the enemy ships came alive, trying desperately to intercept the incoming weapons. They managed to destroy 3 of them. The 4th hit the flagship dead center, and for a brief instant a miniature sun bloomed in the darkness of space. When the light faded, High Commander Zelnoth and his crew of 3,000 were simply gone, along with 2 other ships that had been too close to the blast. The remaining 2 Zeltari vessels broke formation and ran, their engines flaring as they jumped to faster-than-light speed in a panic. Jake let them go. They would spread the word better than any propaganda could. Secure from battle stations, he said quietly. Get rescue teams to the station. Find every survivor and get them aboard. Amy, send a message to Earth Command. Tell them we've neutralized the immediate threat and are conducting search and rescue operations. As his crew moved to comply, Jake stared at the view screen, at the ruins of Haven Station and the expanding cloud of debris that had once been a Zeltari flagship. The cost had been paid. Now came the reckoning. Part 3, the galaxy learned of the attack on Haven Station within hours, and the response was immediate and thunderous. Across human space, from the inner colonies to the frontier outposts, the reaction was not grief but cold, calculated fury. Humanity had spent decades building relationships with alien species, engaging in trade, sharing technology, and advocating for peaceful coexistence. That era ended the moment Zeltari weapons tore through the children's wing. Admiral Richard Stevens stood in the war room beneath Earth Command headquarters, watching holographic displays that showed the rapid mobilization of human forces. Every available warship was being recalled and assigned to battle groups. Reserve fleets that had been mothballed after the last conflict were being recommissioned. Civilian shipyards were being converted to military production under emergency protocols. "We're calling it Operation Reckoning," his second-in-command, Commander Lisa Park, reported. Initial objectives are to secure all human colonies and establish defensive perimeters. Secondary objectives involve locating and neutralizing all Zeltahari Council military assets within our sphere of influence. "And the tertiary objectives?" Stevens asked, though he already knew the answer. Park's expression was grim. "Get total dismantlement of the Zeltari Council's ability to wage war. We're not just defending, sir. We're eliminating the threat permanently." Stevens nodded slowly. He had served in the military for 40 years, had seen combat during the Kresh War and the frontier skirmishes. He had always advocated for restraint, for measured responses and diplomatic solutions. But this was different. The Zeltari had not just attacked a military target, or killed soldiers who had signed up knowing the risks. They had deliberately targeted children, had blown them apart while they slept, and then had the audacity to call it collateral damage. There would be no restraint this time. "What's the status of the Independence?" he asked. Captain Morrison's ship sustained moderate damage but remains operational. They've recovered 93 survivors from Haven Station, mostly adults who were in the lower shelters when the attack occurred. The casualty count stands at 219 dead. 167 of them were under the age of 18. Stevens closed his eyes briefly. 167. The number would be broadcast across every news network, printed in every newspaper, discussed in every household. It would become a rallying cry that would echo for generations. "What about the Zeltari response?" he asked. Their council has issued a statement claiming the attack was a rogue operation by High Commander Zelnoth, acting without proper authorization. They're calling for calm and offering to open negotiations. Lies. The word came from Captain Victoria Hayes, commander of the battleship Retribution. She had joined the meeting via holographic link from her ship, currently stationed near Mars. Intelligence intercepts show the attack was approved at the highest levels of their government. They're just trying to avoid the consequences now that they realize we're serious about responding. Stevens agreed. The Zeltari Council had made a calculated decision, believing that humanity would accept diplomatic apologies and reparations rather than risk a full-scale war. They had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. "Send them a message," Stevens said. "Tell them we're not interested in negotiations. Tell them that as of this moment, all Zeltari military vessels in human space have 24 hours to withdraw to their own territory. Any ship that remains after that deadline will be destroyed. Any attempt to attack human assets will be met with overwhelming force. And tell them that we're coming for the individuals responsible for ordering the attack on Haven Station. They can surrender them for trial, or we'll take them." Park looked uncomfortable. "Sir, that's essentially a declaration of war?" "No, Commander. That's a declaration of justice. War is what happens when they refuse." Across the solar system, the human war machine churned to life. Shipyards in orbit around Earth worked around the clock, their foundries glowing bright enough to be seen from the surface as they produced weapons, ammunition, and replacement parts. The massive shipyards orbiting Jupiter, built during the Kresh War and never fully decommissioned, roared back to operation, their construction bays filling with the skeletal frames of new warships. On Mars, the training facilities that had been preparing colonists for peaceful exploration, thousands of volunteers lined up to enlist, driven by rage and a desire for vengeance. The recruitment centers couldn't process them fast enough. Meanwhile, in the diplomatic sphere, humanity's allies watched nervously. The Torvek Confederacy, which had maintained friendly relations with both humans and the Zeltari Council, tried to position itself as a neutral mediator. The Kimsey Collective, a species that had benefited greatly from human trade, issued statements of concern and called for restraint. None of it mattered. Humanity had made its decision. Captain Morrison and the Independents remained at Haven Station, coordinating rescue operations and documenting the crime scene. Every body was carefully recovered and identified, Every piece of evidence was cataloged. Forensic teams worked through the debris, reconstructing the attack pattern and confirming what everyone already knew. The Zeltari had deliberately targeted the children's wing with precision weapons, not as collateral damage, but as the primary objective. The reason why became clear when intelligence analysts examined the communications intercepts. The Zeltari Council had believed that striking at human children would break humanity's will to resist their trade sanctions and political demands. They had studied human psychology and concluded that the loss of children would make humans desperate for peace at any cost. They could not have been more wrong. Humans did not become desperate when their children were threatened. They became dangerous on the third day after the attack. The deadline passed. 17 Zeltari military vessels remained in what humanity considered its sphere of influence, either because they hadn't received the withdrawal order, didn't believe humans would follow through on the threat, or were unable to leave due to mechanical issues. Admiral Stevens gave the order personally: eliminate all hostile vessels. No warnings, no second chances. Human warships operating in coordinated battle groups struck simultaneously across multiple star systems. The engagements were brief and brutally one-sided. Zeltari shields, designed to defend against conventional energy weapons, proved inadequate against human kinetic weapons that punched through them like paper. Zeltari point defense systems, optimized for large missile intercepts, couldn't track the swarms of smaller human missiles that overwhelmed their targeting computers. In less than 6 hours, all 17 ships were destroyed. Nearly 20,000 Zeltari military personnel died, and humanity broadcast footage of every engagement to the galaxy, along with a simple message: "This is what happens when you break the one rule we told you mattered." The Zeltari Council, seeing the writing on the wall, finally capitulated. They agreed to surrender the individuals responsible for ordering the Haven Station attack, to pay reparations, and to accept human observers to ensure compliance with the agreement. But Stevens wasn't finished. Not good enough, he told the Zeltari ambassador during their communication. You're going to dismantle your military down to defensive forces only. You're going to open your government records for inspection. And you're going to broadcast an apology to every species in the galaxy, admitting what you did and why it was wrong. Those are our terms, non-negotiable. The ambassador's mandibles clicked in what might have been protest or fear. You're demanding we make ourselves defenseless? But that's unreasonable. You should have thought of that before you murdered our children, Stevens replied coldly. You have 1 week to comply. After that, we stop being reasonable. Part 4. The trial of the Zeltari Council members began 30 days after the attack on Haven Station, held not on Earth but on Luna, in a specially constructed courtroom that allowed for proper atmospheric controls for the various species involved. The proceedings were broadcast live across the galaxy, translated into 600 languages, and watched by billions of people. 9 ex-Zeltari officials sat in the defendant area, their chitinous bodies encased in transparent containment fields. They included High Counselor Thexnar, who had given the final authorization for the attack, along with military commanders and intelligence officers who had planned and executed it. The chief prosecutor was a human woman named Lauren Mitchell, a former military lawyer who had lost her own daughter in a shuttle accident years earlier. She stood before the court in her formal attire, her expression composed but her eyes burning with barely contained emotion. What we discuss here today is not merely an act of war, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. It is an act of depravity that violates every principle of civilized conduct. The defendants stand accused of deliberately targeting and killing 167 children, the youngest of whom was 6 months old, the oldest 17 years. They did this not in the heat of battle, not as an accident of war, but as a calculated strategy to terrorize humanity into submission. She activated a holographic display that showed Haven Station before the attack, families walking through corridors, children playing in the recreation areas, teachers preparing lessons in the school. Then the image shifted to the aftermath. Twisted metal, frozen bodies floating in space, parents searching desperately through the wreckage for any sign of their children. The defense will argue that this was a military operation targeting legitimate objectives, Mitchell continued. They will claim that the colonists were harboring resistance fighters who had violated trade sanctions. Let me address that claim directly. Even if it were true, and I emphasize that no evidence supports it, it would not justify what happened. There is no military objective that justifies the murder of sleeping children. There is no political goal that makes it acceptable to target a school. There is no strategic advantage worth the price of 167 young lives. The Zeltari defense attorney, a member of the Torvek species named Grendal, who had agreed to represent them out of a commitment to legal process, stood to respond. The prosecution speaks with understandable emotion, but we must separate feeling from fact. Under Galactic Convention Article 17, military forces are permitted to strike at installations that provide material support to hostile forces. Haven Station's research facilities were developing weapons technology, agricultural technology, Mitchell shot back. They were researching crop enhancement to help feed colonists in low-atmosphere environments. The defense is attempting to conflate civilian research with military development, and it won't work. We have the station's complete records. Every project, every experiment, every piece of research. Nothing was classified. Nothing was weapons-related. She pulled up another display, this one showing messages between the Eltari Council members in the days before the attack. The translations were clear and damning. High Counselor Thexnar, the humans must be taught that their expansion has limits. A demonstration is required. Military Commander Vex Cole, recommend targeting their colony infrastructure. Maximum psychological impact with minimal military risk. Intelligence Officer Kilnix, analysis suggests humans form strong emotional bonds with their offspring. Striking at their young will create political pressure on their leadership to negotiate. The courtroom fell silent as the messages played. Even the Zeltahari defendants seemed to shrink in their containment fields. Mitchell let the silence stretch before continuing. They knew exactly what they were doing. They studied us, identified what they believed was a weakness, and exploited it. They thought we would break. They thought we would beg for peace. They were wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Forensic analysis showed that the Zeltari weapons had been calibrated for maximum effect against the children's wing structure. Survivors testified about the attack, describing how the first explosions came without warning, how parents ran toward the children's wing only to be cut down by follow-up strikes, how the Zeltari ships had remained in orbit for 30 minutes after the attack, scanning to ensure maximum casualties. The defense attempted various strategies, claiming the defendants were following orders from higher authorities who couldn't be prosecuted, arguing that different species had different moral frameworks that made judgment impossible, suggesting that humanity's response had been disproportionate and therefore invalidated their moral authority. None of it worked. Captain Jake Morrison testified on the 8th day of the trial, describing what he had seen when the Independents arrived at Haven Station. His voice remained steady as he recounted finding a teddy bear floating in the debris field, still clutched in the frozen hand of a 4-year-old girl. He described organizing the recovery operations, listening to the survivors scream as they learned their children were dead, watching parents identify bodies through viewing ports because bringing them aboard would have contaminated the evidence. The Zeltahari like to think they understand humans. They studied our psychology, our culture, our history. But they missed something fundamental. They thought attacking our children would make us weak. They didn't realize it would make us relentless. When the testimony concluded, the judges, a panel consisting of 3 humans and 2 aliens from species that had no connection to either side, retired to deliberate. They returned after only 4 hours. We find the defendants guilty on all counts, the chief judge announced. Crimes against sentient life, deliberate targeting of civilians, conspiracy to commit mass murder, and violations of 17 articles of the Galactic Conventions. The sentences will be delivered tomorrow. That night, across human space, people gathered in public squares and community centers to watch the verdict. There was no celebration, no cheering, just a quiet, grim satisfaction that justice was being served. The next day, the sentences were delivered: life imprisonment in a human-run facility with no possibility of parole or release. The Zeltari would spend the rest of their natural lives in confinement, forced to contemplate what they had done. Some observers argued the punishment was too lenient, that the defendants should have been executed. Others praised humanity for maintaining its principles even in the face of such provocation. Admiral Stevens addressed those concerns in a press conference after the sentencing. "We could have killed them," he said simply. "We could have destroyed their entire civilization in retaliation, but we didn't because we're not them. We're better than that. Justice doesn't require vengeance. It requires accountability. These individuals will spend the rest of their lives knowing what they did, knowing that they failed, and knowing that their actions didn't break us. That's punishment enough." Part 5. 6 months after the attack on Haven Station. Humanity stood at a crossroads. Burial. The immediate crisis had passed. The Zeltari Council had collapsed under the weight of internal dissent, their species fragmenting into smaller factions as populations revolted against the leadership that had brought catastrophe upon them. Human military forces maintained a watchful presence throughout the sector, ensuring that the disarmament agreements were honored. But the scars remained. Captain Morrison stood in the observation lounge of the Independence, watching as construction crews worked to rebuild Haven Station. The colony would live again, but it would never be the same. A memorial was being built on the site where the children's wing had stood, a massive structure of transparent steel and eternal flame that would serve as a reminder of what had been lost and why it must never happen again. They say 100 new families have volunteered to relocate here, Lieutenant Amy Chen said, joining him at the window. They want to prove that we can't be driven away by fear. That's good, Morrison replied. The children should be remembered by life, not death. Do you think we did the right thing, sir, the way we responded? Morrison considered the question. In the months since the attack, there had been endless debates about humanity's reaction. Some argued that the massive military buildup had been excessive, that diplomatic pressure would have achieved the same results without the risk of wider conflict. Others claimed humanity had shown restraint when total war would have been justified. I think we did what we had to do, he said finally. The galaxy needed to understand that there are lines you don't cross, that children are off limits no matter what political or military objectives you're pursuing. If we had responded with anything less than overwhelming force, it would have sent a message that attacking kids was acceptable as long as you apologized afterward. Chen nodded slowly. The Qinshi ambassador said something interesting last week. He said that before Haven Station, most species saw humans as just another spacefaring race. Friendly enough, useful trading partners, but nothing special. Now they see us differently. How so? He said they finally understand why we spend so much time establishing rules of engagement and conventions for warfare. It wasn't because we're peaceful, it's because we know exactly how terrible we can be when those rules are broken. Morrison smiled grimly. That's more insight than most species manage. Across the galaxy, the aftermath of Haven Station continued to reshape political and military dynamics. The incident had exposed a fundamental truth that many alien species had not fully grasped. Humans might prefer peace, but they excelled at war. The technology, tactics, and industrial capacity they had developed over centuries of fighting each other translated terrifyingly well to interstellar conflict. Other species began reassessing their relationships with humanity. Trade agreements were honored more scrupulously. Diplomatic disputes were resolved more quickly. Border incidents decreased dramatically. Nobody wanted to be the next example of what happened when you pushed humanity too far. On Earth, the political landscape shifted as well. The attack had unified a species that had been increasingly divided along political, cultural, and ideological lines. Colonies that had been discussing independence realized the value of collective defense. Factions that had opposed military spending suddenly supported it. The common threat had created common purpose. Admiral Stevens retired 3 months after the trial, his mission accomplished. In his final address to the fleet, he spoke about the lessons of Haven Station. We didn't want this war, he said. We didn't seek this conflict. But when it came to us, when our children were threatened, we responded with a full measure of our capability. Let that be our legacy. Let the galaxy know that humanity will always defend the innocent, will always stand against those who target the defenseless, and will always exact the price from those who mistake our preference for peace as an inability to wage war. His words were carved into the memorial at Haven Station, alongside the names of every child who had died in the attack. Time passed. Years became decades. The children's memorial became a pilgrimage site, visited by millions who wanted to pay respects and remember. New generations grew up hearing the story of Haven Station, learning about the day the galaxy learned that humanity's most sacred rule was the protection of children. The Zeltari, diminished and divided, spent those years rebuilding their civilization under human oversight. Some of their younger generations traveled to Haven Station to see the memorial, to understand what their leaders had done and why it had nearly destroyed their species. A few even stayed working on the reconstruction efforts as a form of penance. Slowly, carefully, reconciliation became possible. Not forgiveness, the crime was too great for that, but acknowledgement and the beginning of healing. Captain Morrison eventually took command of a larger vessel, then became an admiral himself, overseeing the expansion of human defensive networks. He never forgot Haven Station, never stopped thinking about the children who had died under his watch. Every decision he made was filtered through the lens of that terrible day. On the 50th anniversary of the attack, an aged Morrison returned to Haven Station for the memorial ceremony. The colony had grown into a thriving city, home to thousands of families and children who played in parks and attended schools without fear. The children's wing had been rebuilt, larger and more beautiful than before, with walls of reinforced crystal that let in the light of the system's sun. Standing before the memorial flame, Morrison delivered a speech to the assembled crowd, many of whom had been born long after the attack. 50 years ago, evil came to this place, he said, his voice still strong despite his age. It came with ships and weapons and the belief that hurting children would break our spirit. Those who did this learned a lesson that echoed across the galaxy. You cannot terrorize humanity into submission. You can only unite us in our determination to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. He paused, looking at the names carved in the memorial. These children did not die in vain. Their deaths reminded the galaxy that there are rules that must not be broken, lines that must not be crossed. They reminded us of our own humanity, our own capacity for both restraint and righteous fury. Let us honor them by building a galaxy where no child, human or alien, ever has to fear what happened here. The crowd stood in silence, and across the galaxy, billions watched and remembered. Pavin Station had become more than a colony. It had become a symbol of humanity's values, a declaration written in the stars that children everywhere deserved protection, and that those who violated that principle would face consequences beyond their worst nightmares. And in the darkness of space, human warships patrolled the borders of their territory, vigilant and ready. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Galactic Law Number 1 existed for a reason, and humanity had proven they would enforce it no matter the cost. The memorial flame burned eternal, a beacon of memory and warning that would shine for generations to come.